Now, as we've established, computer hardware describes the physical components of a computer. Some of these components you can see with your eyes, while others are hidden away out of sight within the computer casing, or they might even be too tiny for you to see at all. Interestingly enough, there are certain components within the components of a computer system that are so small they can't even be seen with an optical microscope. As always, you need to be familiar with certain terminology when you talk about certain aspects of a computer. So in this morsel, we're going to dissect a typical computer system to get ourselves familiar with the basic components of any modern computing system. While I don't promise any groundbreaking revelations for anyone that might already be familiar with basic computer hardware, I do promise plenty of memes. The first hardware component that we'll look at is probably the one that typically receives the least attention and is considered the least important in a consumer environment. But it actually surprisingly is relatively important in an enterprise environment, and that is the computer case, or as it is sometimes called, the housing. And that is basically the big outside box that the computer components are stored neatly and securely inside. You can see from this slide that there are many different types of chassis that are actually available to us, and we'll go into a little more detail about some of the major ones that you'll consider when designing your HPC system. Okay, and before we continue, maybe it's important to address that big elephant in the room, that burning question. What on earth could be so important about a computer box? Well, in an enterprise environment, and for your own physical systems that you may design in later stages of the competition, the consideration for how you place your systems based on existing or even non-existent infrastructure can play a significant role. In enterprise, we typically don't call a computer housing a box because people would be very upset to spend as much money as they do on what is essentially labeled a box. Instead, in enterprise, we call them a chassis. And the first chassis to be aware of is the rack-mounted chassis. These are placed inside a dedicated server rack, and hence their term rack-mounted chassis. Each rack-mounted chassis will have a U rating, which describes its height, and these will determine how many you can fit in a rack. And each rack also has a U rating for how many U's it can hold. So for example, if this was a 2U system and this was a 48U rack, you can work it out. But not everyone will be blessed to have access to a rack. And when you don't have a rack, you can still use rack-mounted servers, but they won't be placed in a rack. They'll be placed in a less ideal setup, like the pizza stack. Pizza is obviously very popular with students because many teams historically opt for the pizza stack option when they design their clusters. And that's perfectly fine because you can save money on your racks. But you do need to remember that there are dedicated air vents, as I'm highlighting here, that are above and below each chassis. So when you do a pizza stack, these will block those vents. So you might have to consider staggering your servers when you stack them in order to reduce the issue of heat from blocked vents. The other option for a chassis is the standalone tower option. The reason that they're called towers is self-evident. Some of these tower chassis can also be tilted sideways by 90 degrees and slide in as a rack-mounted unit, while others simply stand upright as illustrated here, and they can either be standing separately or inside a rack on top of a base plate on a rack shelf. Functionally, it makes little difference whether a chassis is rack-mounted or tower style, but typically a tower would be a cheaper option for the equivalent rack-mounted option because towers are larger and in some ways less appealing if you have limited space in a data center because you can fit fewer within a single rack. But don't let that put you off a tower. Towers don't need any sophisticated repurposing of internal components because they are larger chassis. A rack-mounted chassis, on the other hand, needs to have its components shrunk down to fit into the somewhat smaller rack chassis size. So this does become a concern when you're buying add-on components for a rack chassis. They are smaller in height typically, so you need to make sure that you have a smaller profile expansion card that will fit inside your rack chassis. That being said, you can get equivalent performance from a rack chassis and a tower chassis, but typically you will save money by purchasing a tower chassis. As a rule of thumb, if your priority is saving space because you have limited infrastructure available, then you'd probably opt for a rack chassis. And if budget was more of a concern than actual space in a data center, then you'd probably prioritize a tower over a rack chassis. The main component that goes inside the chassis is the motherboard. The motherboard is essentially the base plate that all other hardware components will plug into. And you can see here there are many different types of slots and sockets for other devices to plug into on this motherboard. The other base components that you'd find in a standalone system include the CPU. The CPU is a central processing unit, and that inserts into the socket on the motherboard. The memory, or RAM, which is an acronym for random access memory, will then slot into memory slots allocated on the motherboard. And finally, you will have an optional disk drive. Typically this would be the old hard disk drive, the HDD, or the more modern SSD or solid state drive. This is now an optional component because nowadays many systems, particularly HPC nodes, operate exclusively on memory. These are called diskless systems, and that is mostly attributed to the fact that we have large distributed storage in a data center, so all these nodes can access that storage across a high-speed interconnect. And those are pretty much the basic hardware components that you would need in order to produce a functional computer system. Again, of all of these listed components, the disk drive, while it is still a very common component, it is not explicitly necessary for a functional machine, given that we can have distributed storage. In subsequent morsels of this chapter, we'll go into a little more depth about some of these components.